There is going to be a little bit of a spoiler alert here. I want to introduce Alexis Hyatt, who is playing Francis Hunter in the play, Scott Cody playing Brian Runnacles, and I'd like to introduce our new managing director, Eric Bungie, who is joining us today as well. We also have one of our acting interns here, Casey Brown, who is also in the show. Yes, she's playing
I'm blocking her, I'm sorry.
she's playing a lady of the night.
Whoa!
Yes, yes. So, No Sex Please We're British. Just very briefly, a little bit of the storyline. There is a newly-wed couple who is living in an apartment over a bank where the husband of the couple is living. Working. Peter and Francis have been married for 3 weeks. And they live over the bank where Peter works. And Frances, in an effort to make some extra money on the side, she sends away to the Scandinavian import company to order some glassware. She wants to sell like Tupperware and to get a little bit more cash to perhaps get them into their own home at some point. And what arrives in the mail is not Scandinavian glassware, but Scandinavian pornography. It comes in the form of, at first, postcards, and then through a series of mishaps, they inadvertently send more money to the Scandinavian import company. You'll have to watch the play to find out why they continue to send money to the company. And then some films show up, blue films show up. And then after the films show up, then some books show up, books with titles like 1001 Perversions. One of the films that shows up is Dick Turpin Rides Again and Again and Again. And then ultimately, in the second act, two ladies of the night, courtesy of the Scandinavian import company, show up. So that's basically the premise, and then hilarity and farcical nature ensues. This play was written by Alistair Foote and Anthony Marriott. They are very, very challenging playwrights to find any information about on the internet, and I'm not quite sure why, but that's the case.
They never had another success.
Well, they actually had some minor successes, but it was written in 1970 and it was produced on the West End in 1971, and it was actually panned on the West End. And then 3 other theaters ended up picking up the play in London, and it ran until 1987 in those 3 theaters. And by the time we got to February of 1979, it had been performed in 52 countries, and it was at that time the longest running comedy in the history of world theater. So who knew? It came over, and it reminded me a little bit of Boeing Boeing because it came to Broadway in 1973 and only had 16 performances. And Boeing Boeing did not do well when it first came over to Broadway, but it wasn't until that revival of Boeing Boeing that it achieved the success that it did. No Sex Please We're British has not been revived in New York, although given what's been going on in the last 3 days, I think it should be. Yes. Anthony Marriott, one of the playwrights, just to give you an idea, he was a playwright and an actor, and some of the other plays that he worked on, and I think there is a slight continuous theme here with his titles and thoughts. 3 other plays that he had written. One was called No Room for Sex. The last one being Home is Where Your Clothes Are. So, Anthony Marriott there. The thing about No Sex Please We're British that I find intriguing is that it's billed as a comedy in 2 acts, but it has much more farcical elements and structure to it than a regular comedy would be. And I very much exploit and enjoy the rules and regulations of farce, because if you stick to those rules and regulations, the farce has a greater chance of succeeding. And farce comes from the word farcir, French word in the 13th century, which means to stuff or cram. And I think that that's a perfect etymology of the word, because you are stuffing and cramming a lot of things in the structure of a farce, and the mishaps that go on. So it's a very compact genre, and some of the things that I exploit, I love the fact that most farces take place in a 24-hour period, so that compacts the dramatic tension, although this play, there's a 2-day difference from scene 1 to scene 2, and then scene 2 into act 2, it's continuous from one evening. So it's really only 48 hours, so that's okay for us as far as being able to cram what goes on in this short amount of time. It takes place in one location. It takes place in the flat of Frances and Peter. And one of the things that I love about Farce is the mistaken identity. And there are 2 examples of mistaken identity in the play. One is the regional branch manager, Arnold Needham, is at first mistaken for the gentleman who heads the Scandinavian import company as the pornographer, or the gentleman who is selling the pornography. And in No Sex, Please, We're British, the play starts off with an object being the mistaken identity. The fact that this glassware, she thought it was going to be glassware, ultimately ends up being pornography. So I thought it rather fascinating that mistaken identity happens not only with a human being, but with an inanimate object, which sets the entire play in motion. There is also a small element of disguise in the play. Scott Cody plays Brian Runnacles, who is the chief cashier. He is the chief cashier at the bank downstairs, and at one point he gets very much involved in the antics, and unwittingly and unwillingly gets involved in the antics. And at one point he has to disguise himself with a oversized mustache, a raincoat, and a hat.
We haven't gotten there yet.
We haven't gotten there yet. And then there are a number of varying levels of verbal humor as far as puns, and there's visual puns, which we'll show you in just a moment. There's sexual innuendo and whatnot, but I will assure you that I think it's one of the cleanest plays that deals with pornography that I've had an opportunity to work on. Yes, given especially...
No one has a pornograph.
No one has a pornograph, exactly.
Way up here.
There you go. Virtually all farces are about concealment. And we've talked before in Script Club about the approach of finding a dramatic center for a play. What's the one thing that drives the play throughout the end of the play? And from that one word that drives the play, so many decisions get made in terms of blocking, in terms of set design, in terms of light design, and even to a degree costume and prop choices, which I'll show you in just a moment. But at the other end of the dramatic center, you want to find the opposite of that dramatic center, and the opposite of concealment would be revelation, or in this particular play, I think the better word would be exposure. So there is this dynamic and dramatic tension between concealment and exposure, although nobody really truly gets completely physically exposed. Although the 2 ladies of the night, they do expose a few things, but we never succumb to nudity. As with most farces, there are a number of doors, and Peter Saccio, you want to write an essay about doors, do you not? And
The title has been in my head for some time after watching your productions.
Yes.
Doors, the wooden heart of comedy.
yes, there are 6 doors on this particular set. And, yes, and actually I'll pass around. I don't have a model. I have just some quick little photographs of the model and some of the colors, and I will talk about how Kim Powers and I arrived at the set design, because it was pretty important to me what this play looked like. So in rehearsing the farce, actually with No Sex, Please, We're British, our extraordinary production team, all of the walls are up in the rehearsal space up there, and in another day or 2 we're probably going to have the doors with us. And one of the things that's very important to me in terms of exploiting the nature of farce is the percussion of doors with the dialogue. And I have the actors, and you can talk about whether or not it's an imposition or not, that in not having the doors right now, I ask them to say slam when they exit, so that when the door slams, then the next door opens, or the door slams and then the next line happens, so that they, I had a couple of years ago, when they actually had the doors, by the time we got to the theater, the actors were still saying slam, and I said, no, the doors are there, you're okay. Yeah, so, and one of the things that is, after we started rehearsing, we read through the play on Tuesday, we had finished blocking all of Act One, and after retracing only just the first scene yesterday, we were all pretty exhausted.
Of course.
It moves at a breakneck speed because, and we talked about this, I talked about this with the cast, that in good farces, the characters they very rarely have time to think about how to solve the problem. They have to think about solving the problem on their feet. And that requires lying, frequent, unabashed lying, and discussing with, say, Brian Runicles or Frances Hunter, how quickly and how good they are at lying, because these are all smart characters in this farce. And if someone is lying, you can normally tell when someone's lying. They've done many studies. Normally when you lie, the pitch of your voice goes up. Oh, John, your hair looks really lovely today, right? And so I want to make sure that it does look really attractive, I promise. So I wanted to make sure, and it was one of the first things that I said, was that these are very smart, sharp people who can lie very quickly on their feet. But at the same time, riding that fine balance of, we've got to see that they've got to come up with something that's not truthful on their feet, if that makes sense. So as far as the look of this particular play goes, Kim Powers, who has designed Laughter on the 23rd Floor, this year she designed Born Yesterday for us. She designed Boeing Boeing. She designed Hamlet, not Hamlet, I Hate Hamlet. And Kim and I have, over the years, she has literally designed almost every comedy I've directed here. And normally when I call her and we do our concept design, she's like, okay, let's just start with doors. And that's where we start. But I had YouTubed some videos, and I asked Alexis not to look at this. I YouTubed some videos of No Sex, Please, We're British, and I found it rather frumpy. And I found it rather, I subscribe to the incongruity in comedy that if a farmer falls into some mud, it's not necessarily funny. If you see a guy in a tuxedo fall into some mud, then that incongruity makes it a little bit more funny, so long as the guy in the tuxedo doesn't get hurt. So, excuse me, in the script itself, there is no indication really of what this apartment looks like. And there's one small comment that Frances's mother-in-law makes about it being a blend of the old and the new. The apartment is over this old bank building, and it's a young couple that's moved in there. And one of the things, oddly enough, that set me on the path of the design of the show, which is very, very important to me, was the fact that in a little stage direction, it mentions the fact that Vogue, the magazine Vogue, is on the set. And I started thinking, then I started thinking a lot about Frances Hunter and the fact that she's reading Vogue. She's not reading Good Housekeeping, she's not reading Family Circle, she's reading the premier fashion magazine of the day. And even though the play was written in 1971 and ran through 1987, I wanted to go back in time a little bit. And I started looking at doing some research about Diana Vreeland, who was the editor of Vogue in the 60s, and how she was not only just on the cusp of fashion and literature, but of the sexual revolution. And I thought that that fit rather nicely with the nature of the play that we're investigating. And so in starting to think about, well, Frances is reading Vogue, and she's trying to save money for her own home, and there is a blend of the old and new. In talking to Kim Powers and Lori, our costume designer, who I wish she could be here. Lori is a Tony Award nominee. She designed the costumes for the revival of The Price on Broadway. And she worked for 8 or 9 seasons on Saturday Night Live. She worked for several seasons on 30 Rock. So when she and I started talking, I said, I think that we should get out of the 70s and backdate a little bit because of this Vogue thing and because of Diana Vreeland. In the 70s, whenever I've seen a play that takes place in the 70s and costumes go full bore, full out, you get involved in, oh look, they're wearing bell bottoms, I suffered through that. Oh look, they're wearing Nehru collars, I suffered through that. And the 70s to me, as far as fashion is concerned, did not accentuate the silhouette of the human form the way that the 60s does, the way that the 50s does, the way that the 40s does. And given that there's, it's a young, sexual, sensual couple, that I wanted to make sure that the show had some sort of a Mad Men quality from the television show, that there was a sensuality in the silhouette of the form of everyone. So then Kim Powers and I started talking about the Dick Van Dyke Show. And we talked about Mad Men, how clean these lines are, because if it's a frumpy-dumpy apartment and something goes wrong in a frumpy-dumpy apartment, then it's just like the farmer falling into the mud. So we wanted this very clean, very sleek, very economical apartment so that when things go wrong, there's room for physicality in our very talented physical actors. So that's how we ended up saying, let's move it back a little bit in time. And it all came from this Vogue magazine. As far as casting is concerned, this was one of the most probably, what's the word I'm looking for, non-traditional way that we've cast a show, because we did not have any kind of call in New York. We didn't have any kind of submissions for actors. It was cast primarily out of friends and family, somewhat a little late in the ballgame, with the exception of Scott Cody. And Brian Runnacles in the play, I have to say, is the linchpin of the farce. Would you?
Yes.
Of course he is, yeah. And knowing that, having worked with Scott for several years in Moon Over Buffalo, what else? Boeing, and several projects.
Everything else.
Everything else. And Scott, when we first selected the play last spring, we knew that Scott Cody had to play Brian Runnacles. And we can talk a little bit about some of Scott's and my conversation about the difference between the character in Boeing that he played and Brian Runnacles, because both Robert in Boeing and Brian in No Sex Please Were British, he serves the exact same function as sort of being the foil and the fall guy, and having all of this go wrong because of him, in spite of him, around him, and it gets dumped into his lap. So we knew that Scott was going to play Brian Runnacles, and as we've had a season of tremendous transition, as we were getting closer and closer to the second half of the season, I started thinking about, okay, are we going to be able to fit a New York casting trip in? And I'm looking at the play and the cast list, and I'm thinking, we know these people. Northern Stage has these people in their family and in their back pocket. So I was working just recently on Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, and I happened to share a dressing room with a young woman playing Gwendolyn. And she said to me one night, she said, look, I would really love to read for No Sex Please Were British. Has Frances been cast yet? And I said no. And I did one of those, yeah, well, we'll figure out a time to read, we'll figure that out. And in the meantime, Kim Sullivan, who works here, one of her dearest friends is an actor in New York, Megan Grace O'Leary, and she is engaged to a young man by the name of Dane Clark. They're both actors in New York. And I ran into them, they were up here visiting in January. And they said, oh, we'd really love to read for No Sex Please Were British. And I said, yeah, okay. And so Megan and Dane went back to New York, and they put their auditions on tape. And Dane was reading for Peter Hunter, the husband of Frances, and Megan was reading for Frances Hunter as well. So they put those on tape, and I look at Dane, and it was one of those things. Within the first 3 seconds of the video, I said, "Oh, he's absolutely that's Peter Hunter." And I look at Megan, and she's a very similar type, I would say, to you, yes. And
You're not a type. This is a human being.
But do you not have to deal with type all the time?
Of course.
You have
Of
to
course.
deal with, yeah, typing, you know. So I see Megan, and I wish actually she was in here, because on her audition tape, she does a lovely reading of Frances, and then and they're taping in their apartment on a flip cam, that kind of thing, right? And she burst out laughing at the end of the videotape, and I went, "That's got to be Susan. That's got to be Susan, the lady of the night who was training the younger lady of the night." And there was something, yeah, she's the apprentice lady of the night. So, and I mean, this is literally how this all came about. So she burst out laughing once she finished the reading, and I went, that's a sensibility and an energy that this lady of the evening had. So then the next day, I call Alexis's agent, and rather than read her, because it occurs to me that she's been auditioning every night that I'm on stage with her, and had seen her in Les Liaisons and in Amadeus, and I'd worked with Alexis on M. Butterfly, so I just called the agent, and I said, "Look, I'm going to make the offer to Alexis. I'd like her to play Frances Hunter." Okay, great. So I came in the dressing room that
She didn't
night.
say anything. We're sitting back to back, putting on our makeup for the show, and we're just chatting. She says nothing about the offer.
No.
Silent.
And then the next day, I came in, and I didn't say anything, and I sit down, and I put him in.
I got the call that day from my agent. I was like, "What are you talking about? Of course I want to do it." And I came in and hit me.
So then and it almost plays into the, in pure farce, there are meddling parents, you know, normally. And Frances's mother-in-law, Eleanor, and the district branch manager, Leslie Bromhead, they start to develop a little bit of a romantic relationship. And while they are not interfering parents, they sort of function in that they have to conceal what's going on with the pornography to Eleanor and to Leslie. And so I started thinking about Eleanor, and she is sort of a modern day Lady Bracknell, but not quite. And I started thinking about, it's very challenging, and this is an industry problem, it's challenging to find a woman over 40 who is available, who is really talented, because there's so few roles for women over the age of 40, and they're normally not available because if they're any good, they're and whatnot. And I had just, I have been in touch with Kathryn Kendall, who is a very dear friend who I met through Drew Taylor, who was in M. Butterfly. And Kathryn Kendall ended up doing the studio recording of the musical that Brett Schreier and I wrote, Take Two. She did the studio recording, and she played the role of Sam, the mother, and fabulous on the recording. And having heard the recording thousands of times, she had a terrific sense of humor. So I emailed her and I said, "Would you be interested? Would you be available? Would you think about it?" And come in. This is Dane Clark playing Peter. Oh, great. So glad you missed the whole story of why I cast you.
They've seen me.
I'm going to see you even more in a moment. So I emailed Kathryn, and she had just finished a tour of White Christmas, a national tour of White Christmas. And I emailed her and I said, "Would you be interested? Would you be available? Oh my gosh, I would love it. I'd love to come to Northern Stage. I've heard, and it's lovely to hear, we were talking about this last night, it's lovely to hear from new people at Northern Stage what they've heard about Northern Stage down in New York. And they were talking about this last night, and Kathryn had seen shows at Northern Stage and had been to M. Butterfly, said, yes, 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 yes. This is Megan. She is, she's the senior lady of the evening, doing the training. So Kathryn Kendall, I said, all right, I'll call your agent and see what's what, and taken care of. And then it was Leslie Bromhead trying to figure out who, and again, an older gentleman who has a sense of humor, can play this sort of stuffy district branch manager, and I went to Tom Treadwell, who played FDR in Annie at Northern Stage. Emailed him, said interested, available, because I wanted to touch base with the actors before I got a hold of the agents, and yes, 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 please, I would love to, I would love to, I would love to. And it started to occur to me that having worked with Alexis before, haven't worked with these two, and it's been delightful, having worked with Scott, it's a little daunting to do a farce with people that you haven't worked with before, because you have to very quickly establish as much of a shorthand or a vocabulary or an environment where you can start creating your own dictionary of, what are some of the things we have already? Hot potato.
Hot potato.
Eat your toast, and a hot potato became immediately part of our dictionary. One of the boxes of pornography, they play hot potato with it. And so now that's part of our dictionary of, oh, let's go back to the hot potato moment and see if we can't clean that up or do what have you. And so farce needs very physical performers. And because farce has a rhythm and a musicality, the fact that Kathryn and Tom, who are musical theater performers, and you've done musical theater, I think you've done a little bit, I'm not sure, yes. It's almost like one of the, and I'm going back to Dick Van Dyke, one of the reasons that television historians talk about the success of the Dick Van Dyke Show was because Mary Tyler Moore and Dick Van Dyke were musical theater performers. So there is a physical elegance and a physicality and being able to deal with tripping over that ottoman and climbing through hatches that I'm asking these actors to do. I realized that I ultimately ended up with just pretty much the perfect cast for this particular show. And given the way that the read-through went on Tuesday, people were crying, they were laughing so hard, which was terrific. So we're now in, we just finished blocking Act 1, we start blocking Act 2, and it's already turned into, you want to talk a little bit about the physicality of what's going on? Scott?
Yes, Scott.
What should I say? I mean, it's day 3, and right, day 3?
Yeah.
Yes, day 3, and I'm already jumping off things, and I don't know what to say about it.
Why, talk a little bit about doing, talk a little bit about doing comedy and what it requires from you, or what, like when you read No Sex Please, what were some of your initial thinkings about it and about Brian?
Well, when I first read it, knowing that we were doing the British accent, and reading how meticulous Brian is in his dealing with things, I felt like he had to be sort of that staff act British person, and this voice sort of started coming out of me. And I started reading it out loud, and Brian, Peter, how are you? And it just sort of, good morning, thank you, good morning. You know, and it just felt right. And after talking with Kathryn about the look of Brian, how, you know, his jacket is, he measures everything, like it's like an inch from his wrist.
The cuff, how far is it from?
Right
yes.
there, and he's very straight-laced and buttoned, and I have a crew cut and everything, and it just it sort of made sense.
And we talked a little bit about, because the challenge, I think, for Scott a little bit, and I don't mean to put things in your mouth, was that
Robert and Brian are very similar.
Robert and Brian are very, very similar. If you recall, Robert, who was from the Midwest in Boeing, and very much the nebbish, and very very back foot and is unwittingly brought into the whole stewardess complications that go on with Boeing. And Brian serves the same function, but starts off in a much different place. He is very, very confident, whereas Robert was very back foot. Brian is very, very confident and very assured of himself. So
until he starts getting into things, then he's like, what am I doing? Yeah.
Yeah. So, what am I doing?
What am I doing?
And Scott and I, having worked together,
we have a shorthand.
We do have a
We
shorthand.
very much have a shorthand.
And if I can say, Scott, there's a moment where he gets lied about to Leslie about a personal problem that he may have, and it's whispered. Peter has to whisper. He says, I've come for some advice about a personal problem,
yes.
And he's lying. And Peter goes to Leslie and whispers. And Bromhead says, "Oh, I don't want to deal with that. I'll see you later." And just as Bromhead's leaving, he says, "I should get some ointment for that if I were you." And closes the door. And
all she had to say when he was, "Wait." And I'm like, okay, yes, I know what you mean.
And then blow.
Yeah,
and,
wait, then blow.
And that's me at 8 years old watching Jackie Gleason do that, conserve the energy, conserve the energy, conserve the energy. And that's one of the challenges, I think, for both the actors and myself, is really knowing when comedy is all about the explosion of energy and then regrouping it, conserving it, going back to that strategy place, that beginning place, and then boom, and then recovering it. And so I said to Scott, wait, and I think all I did was I said wait, and then all I did was
yes, I got it.
So why don't you show them?
Oh, God.
Yes.
Oh, no.
Yes, you can do it. Yes.
With the lines?
Yes.
Do you have enough room, Scott?
Oh, I don't know. We'll do it over here.
Yeah.
All right,
Do you
so
want me to give you a cue?
that would be lovely.
I should get some ointment for that as soon as possible. Sam.
Get some ointment! What does he mean by that? What am I supposed to be suffering from?
Yes. And that's just from weight and this.
It'll be fleshed out when you see it.
I think that's perfect.
Yeah, it's perfect. Casting physically talented actors, the gestural life in any given play, but particularly with the farces, where gesture can also have a language of its own.
Let me get up again.
Yes, and I think I need the three of you. Yes, yes. Brian comes up in the very beginning of the play, and I'm so sorry I'm going to spoil this for you all, but Brian comes in the beginning of the play with a wedding gift for Frances and Peter, and he was invited to the wedding. He was Peter's best man.
I made the speech to the bridesmaids.
He made the speech to the bridesmaids, and so he reveals the gift that he gives them. Yes. So why don't we take it from the moment of reveal? And you guys can. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Ready to attack.
Yes.
Oh, it's vegetables. Peter, isn't it nice? We must hang it in Eleanor's room while she's with us.
Yes, darling. What is it called, Brian?
Légumes variés de Provence, from an original by Victor Lameau. It's on non-reflecting glass as well. I framed it myself. I've got the tools, you know.
What are those, Brian? Watermelons?
No, cucumbers, actually. The French have very big cucumbers, particularly in Provence. Didn't you notice when you were on your honeymoon?
No, I can't say we did.
Oh, yes, they are at least 50% bigger than ours. They force them on the glass, you know. Anyway, I'm glad you like it.
Oh, we do, don't we, darling?
Okay, hold on for just a second. So, we staged this, and so I asked Scott they forced them under glass, and this is where gesture is so critical. So I gave him a note to play with. Yes. So let's go to that. Tools. So, yes.
What are those, Brian?
So sorry, and I should also say it's important to me. It was important to me that Frances pointed with her pinky and not her index finger. It was just very important to me. I don't know why. But
It's funnier.
Yes.
What are those, Brian? Watermelons?
No, cucumbers, actually. The French have very big cucumbers, particularly in Provence. Didn't you notice when you were on your honeymoon?
I can't say we did, no.
Oh, yes. They are at least 50% bigger than ours. They force them on the glass, you know. Anyway, I'm glad you like it.
Oh, we do, don't we, darling?
All right. So now, in the last couple of times we've done it, I've been meaning to give Scott the note that I want the gesture of force to stay there.
Force them on the glass. Anyway, I'm glad you like it.
Anyway,
I'm
so
glad
let's
you
go
like
back and do that.
Okay. A brand new note.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
What are those, Brian? Watermelons?
No, cucumbers, actually. The French are very big cucumbers, particularly in Provence. Didn't you notice when you were on your honeymoon?
I can't say we did, no.
Well, oh yes, they're at least 50% bigger than ours. They force them on the glass, you know. Anyway, I'm glad you like it.
And just that 2 more seconds, I think, lands the day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, gentlemen.
Yeah. All right.
In the casting as well, I don't know why I'm going to say this probably, it happens with both drama and comedies, but for some reason in comedies, in this cast so far, and I think that it has worked this way, they're like a jazz ensemble, where they will riff off of one another, and even in these early stages where I can see where if somebody's doing something, somebody else will respond on top of that, and then and it just starts to snowball. There's one moment where Frances and Peter are discovered in an accidentally compromising position by
Brian.
Brian and Frances.
They're married.
They're married. They can have it.
Nothing accidental about it.
Yeah, exactly. They've unwrapped one of the packages, and Frances, it's very terrific when you can say to an actor, "Hey, Alexis, when you break out of this, can you do a barrel roll across?" And she's in a teddy and underwear, and
It's a sensible teddy.
it's a sensible teddy. Can you do a barrel roll? And very smartly, she barrel rolls, and these actors so far, one of the things that I love that they're doing is they take advantage of the universe they're working in. And if they see a glass, they see a piece of paper, they see a string, they see a piece of film, they see something, they're living in that world as opposed to sort of waiting for me to say, I want you to, can you live in your world? They're very much looking at what the universe provides for them as far as gesture. And so Alexis barrel rolled out, and the wrapping, the brown paper wrapper, and she knows she's in a teddy, and she's just been discovered by her husband. She took the paper and covered herself, and it ends up being a very lovely, funny little bit that she does. So
It doesn't cover.
what's that?
It doesn't cover.
She tries.
It helps.
It helps. So by having that kind of group, and then the paper gets picked up later, and suddenly that piece of paper became something that it's not in the script, it's not anywhere there, but they're making the world of the play come alive because of their use of the various objects in the universe. Questions?
Is there an intermission where we can recover from our belly laughs?
There is an intermission. Well, and they're gonna need a break as far as,
I think
So
so.
we're not going to use a concession stand?
yes, as a matter of fact, we are. We're, Eric approved that budget line, and we should be getting that order anytime. Yes.
How are you going to keep from laughing?
Well, this morning was.
Scott?
I'm thinking, we're supposed to be, but, I mean, I was noticing you all are having a good time laughing at each other. How are you?
It's
That's
best
gonna be a
to get
challenge.
it out now.
Yeah, this
I mean, we
morning
have
this morning was a rather challenging morning because they couldn't.
was.
And it's kind of like the, I don't say that I give permission, but it's the kind of show, and Carol Dunn said this about Ernest, that if we did end up breaking, then you're just gonna end up breaking. You tried very hard not to, but this show or Boeing, if there is a moment, not that I'm encouraging it, but there may be those moments where you just can't help yourself.
It happened. It happened to me in Boeing, where I broke on stage and the laughter continued in the audience because they could see me trying to hold it in.
It's like the Carol Burnett,
Yeah, it's
Tim
exactly-
Conway,
that's
Harvey
exactly it.
Korman
It's
kind
exactly
of
it.
thing. But I prefer that not. And I will have to say that Dane and to an extent Fred, they have a tough job, and in particular this role of Peter, because he is the straight man. And he is the voice of reason and the straight guy, and doesn't necessarily have a lot of the physicality that he's got to sort of keep trying to figure out how to contain. They both do, but Francis is in a little bit more cahoots with Brian, and I have to say that one of the things that I'm thrilled about Dane, as far as finding a straight guy, the straight man role, who can also be funny, is not necessarily the easiest thing, and Dane is riding that line.
Well,
and must continue to ride that line in the next couple of weeks.
So are you going to perform it where you all just let it all hang out?
And laugh?
And laugh when you feel like...
Please don't.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
No, because that would rob
I
so
know
many
what
jokes.
you mean.
Well, and so much of the play is, it's a terrible thing that's happening. None of
To
it's
that
good.
Terrible
Exactly.
tragedy.
Everything is going wrong, and it's a very big deal. And so, hopefully, I'll get on to, that'll become more real to me, and you'll be less funny to me at some point, maybe, and together.
Last year, when we were at Script Club, and somebody had asked the question, what's the difference between a comedy and a farce? And from my perspective, it's the level of incongruity and the level of improbability. And, with Boeing, the fact that these stewardesses were just near missing. What's happening in this, it being more of a comedy, pretty much everything that happens is quite possible that could happen to them in terms of these deliveries of continued pornography that continues, because they said, and it's 1971, and so we've backed it up to almost not quite a decade, but you inadvertently send 450 pounds to the pornography company, and it's perfectly logical as to why 450 pounds goes into the mail as opposed to 25 pounds. And so it makes perfect sense that this company just keeps sending them. Of course, they're going to get their money's worth. So.
I'm having a problem. If this takes place in 48 hours, is the mail that good?
Special delivery.
Special delivery.
Things come
yeah.
special delivery.
And the
Yes.
British mail was then much better than the American mail.
Okay.
MAIL.
And just to be clear.
Scott's going to have a crew cut?
We're talking about it, well,
Wait, English never have crew cuts.
Well,
Short back and side.
short back and sides.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what we're
Yeah.
talking about. At first, we talked about a crew cut, but then Lori came up with this fabulous image, and I wish she was here so that I could share it, but actually it's going to be a nice little surprise where she's actually, with the haircut that he's going to get, is going to actually accentuate Brian's character that
Wonderful.
much.
I can't wait.
Oh, God.
Can you stand much more?
Yes.
I'd like to mention two things. One, I'm very glad that you kept the period and indeed made it earlier, the 1960s. As I read the play early this week, I thought, pornography isn't like this anymore. Pornography is now all internet stuff.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah,
Nobody has pornographic postcards.
I know. Or 8mm blue films.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's fine. Those of us who are old enough to remember the old pornography, having discovered it in our teens, will have a nostalgic feel about it all.
And I think there's a funness to it, and we talked a little bit about the ladies of the evening, that they're not dirty. There's a whimsy to them, and I said, think a little bit more about Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman as opposed to, and Laurie. They come with costumes. They come equipped with costumes, and it's fun naughty in quotes, as far as I think she has them in naughty Bobby costumes, and there's a naughty Scottish bagpiper. Is that's yeah.
I'm very scoring, I'm sure.
Yes.
So I think it's all in good fun, because the internet just it's destroyed pornography for most of it. No,
May I mention that?
oh, absolutely, yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
you
Please
did,
do.
you did refer to it once.
Yes.
But I was having this fascination with how Kathryn handles doors in Farce. There is a door of a kind that she has never handled before.
Yes.
And I'm eagerly looking forward to it. There is a kitchen hatchway. I think that must be this thing with the diamond.
The diamond
That's right.
pattern,
The diamond
yes.
Pass through?
A pass through at table level.
Okay.
Not, you can't walk through it, but
Well,
other things.
You can
That
jump through it.
remains to be seen.
Uh-oh.
And so there are going to, I am holding up the writing of my learned essay on the wall, because it's going to have a whole new access of material.
Well, and the hatch, it's actually genius writing with the hatch, because the hatch it conceals and it reveals, and it conceals and it reveals, and we actually just started playing with some concealment and revelation this morning, as far as when the hatch comes up, what you see behind the hatch, and the hatch actually opens the show, as far as what Peter and Frances are doing at the top of the show.
And the hatch has a mind of its own.
It flies up on its own and it comes down on its own, and they talk about there being a counterweight problem with the hatch, so, yes, the hatch has definitely become a particular issue.
Following up, there's also a staircase, so I counted 7 doors. Is the staircase going to be the staircase is a door too?
The staircase is a, well, anytime you have a staircase on stage, you're dealing with an ascension or a descension, right? And there's no doorway to the top of the stairs, and the problem is there should be a 7th door. But Kim Powers ran out of real estate at Northern Stage. So she and I figured out how we could shift some things around, but no, the stairway is open. And it's not unlike a little bit of, Eleanor makes a few beauty queen entrances down those stairs. And what she wants to do when she goes up those stairs is another thought. So, other questions? Thoughts from, how's it going so far?
I think it's going great.
Yeah,
It's
I
going
do too.
really well.
It's going very well.
Why?
The fact that we blocked all of Act 1 in really just 3-4 hour blocks, right?
And parts of it are really flying, it feels
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
The first scene in particular.
Oh, they finished one particular sequence where, and they're like, oh my god, and I said, well, you realize, of course, this is going to go twice as fast.
I thought we were flying through that.
Yeah. Well, there can't be any time to think. That's the
Right.
problem with the
Right,
play.
right.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested to hear from them, just what is it that they say in New York about Northern Stage? We hear the phrase often, but I've never heard one of the actors say what it is. I mean, what's the gossip? It certainly, it isn't the scenery in downtown Weber Junction.
No, actually, I think that the scenery is actually
Part of the conversation.
a lot of the talk. Is like it's absolutely beautiful up there. It's an extremely professional theater. Everything is like they're very well organized and professional. They do really great.
Fold them!
They do really great material. I mean, I was sort of unfamiliar. Like Meg knows more about Northern States because she grew up in Hanover.
And Meg was in our first production of Annie.
Mm-hmm.
And Sound of Music.
And, yep,
Yeah, I just saw that picture of hers in
Okay.
Hanover actually, just like a couple weeks ago.
the habit.
But I went online and I just looked through the past seasons, and I was really impressed. I think that Northern Stage has done some really great things, and things that I wouldn't expect to find in a theater in Vermont.
Layman.
And that's sort of, that's what I heard about Northern Stage before I worked here, was that it's sort of this unique Vermont theater that does extraordinary work and pieces that the rest of the country isn't doing. You see so many of the auditions and you're like, all right, okay, I get it. Everyone's doing these 4 shows. And then Northern Stage is doing this incredible body of work. Like, when do you ever get to be in M Butterfly? Who ever gets to see that or be in that or be a part of that? Amadeus is, they tackle these huge, incredible, and there's an audience for it, which is what shocked me so much, is that you do these things and you think, really? Who's up there? Yeah, but they're like,
Some of those
Who's
people
up
from
there?
New Hampshire.
But it's the only show, I mean, it's the only show in the Upper Valley. And for a long, long time, it really was unique in the true definition of the word, because the stuff they were doing at Dartmouth, pardon me, Peter, it stunk.
Well, let's,
I wasn't directing, you don't need my part.
let me shift it back a little bit, because when I first got to Northern Stage, and I really didn't know much about it, I mean, literally, I saw an ad in Playbill and I came up to stage manage, and then the next year stayed here. And one of the things that kept me here was there is an emphasis on process and not necessarily an emphasis on product. Because if the process is there, the product will follow. And that's one of the things that I hear from actors who have, Kathryn Kendall is a perfect example. Sandy Rosenberg, who is going to do Mother Superior in Nonsense, she was on Mamma Mia on Broadway for 8 years, and she said, everybody that I know that goes to Northern Stage talks about what a remarkable experience it is. And you don't hear, oh my God, the houses are sold out, or, it's always standing room only. What they hear about is the process. And if the process is in place, then the product will follow, and so too will the people come to see the show. And we were talking about, actually, in terms of working on a farce, when we first sat down and did the read-through, I said, and I think this is part of the process, I said a couple of things to the actors. I said, first of all, be patient with yourselves. You don't have to be funny right now, because we have to find the funny, we have to earn the funny. Secondly, in working on a farce, and I think this might work with any particular play that you start to explore, but particularly comedy and farce, it's like plastic surgery. There is so much work that has to go in this delicate, whether or not the hand stays down on forced glass, whether it's here, whether you do that at all that kind of work, and then you've got to stitch it up, and it's going to be bruised for a while, but once all the bruises settle down, you don't see any of the stitches. And that's the goal by the time we get to our opening night, is that you don't see any of those stitches. And I think that that's sort of a larger metaphor for what we try and do at Northern Stage, is that the work is very hard, and at times it gets grueling, and I mean, we're working on a comedy, and you see people going, what's the word, what's the line, what's the thing, can we go back, I mean, I'm not getting the timing of this. But by the time you get to opening here, and what is it, we have 10 days. 10 days from 10 days from reading through until when we get in front of an audience, and one of my favorite things, it is right, and it's one of my favorite things that I'll hear from audience members or from a critic is, it looks like they've been working together for months. And that's my job, to make sure they know that that's their job, that we've turned into this fabulous jazz ensemble, which...
Can I answer her question from a different point of view?
Sure.
And you said, where do the people come from? One of the things that Northern Stage has done beautifully is to involve the larger community in what they're doing. We're here today.
Yeah.
We have an open rehearsal. We're backstagers. We make dinners and we stuff envelopes and we do all kinds of things. And it brings in more and more of us because we tell our friends. So that at Christmas we have a dinner for 80 people. I
Yep.
think it was 100 this year. That we feel like we're a part of this process.
We learn so much.
Yeah, and it's fun.
And it's such an extraordinarily magical, special thing that I've only encountered
Yeah,
here.
I've
I've
every
never
other
worked in
theater
a
that
theater
I've
where I
worked at,
knew
nothing
board
like
members
this
by
happens.
name, where you really feel a part of something. And what you've built here is so extraordinary that it's not just the artistic staff, and it's not just the production staff, and it's not just the people who work here, it's the people who surround the theater, that you feel like you're coming into a family.